Hi, everyone. I want to thank Jason and Colleen for inviting me here to tell you my story. So, around 3 years ago, when I started my internal medicine residency, I felt like I had no idea what I was doing. I was terrified that I would hurt someone. My pager was going off constantly, making it impossible to concentrate. And I felt like I was spending more time in front of a computer than I was in front of my patients, many of whom needed things that I could not prescribe them, like stable housing, a personal support system, better health insurance. And this made me feel helpless and frustrated. And as for the medicine itself, there was a lot to learn. Real-life decisions in the hospital were far more nuanced than the ones I made in medical school when taking my multiple choice exams. And much of the time in the hospital, I felt like a bit of an imposter in my white coat. And then there was the grief. In the elderly, death is normal and natural. But I was seeing cases where it just seemed random and unfair. I saw a young woman, a mother of two, her body riddled with metastatic breast cancer. She was dying on hospice. I saw a young man who was dying of a catastrophic infection in the ICU. And sometimes my emotional reaction to these situations came right away. But other times, I was so busy running around the hospital that I didn't feel much of anything in the moment, and my reaction was delayed, days, weeks, sometimes even months. This caused me to burst into tears unexpectedly when I was, say, doing my laundry or watching an Allstate commercial. Are you in good hands? But in a way, I expected this. Dealing with illness, suffering, and death is part of my job description. I'm a doctor. But what I did not expect was that in residency, I would also be grieving the death of parts of myself. As a resident, I worked many 80-hour weeks, sometimes up to 28 hours in a row. It became a regular thing, those pangs of nausea that came around hour number 20 of work, putting my head down in the call room, praying for a few minutes of sleep, only to be awakened by the grating sound of my pager again and again and again. I didn't have much time for a haircut, much less a checkup. I had never been great about exercise and was just too tired to start that now. I subsisted on hospital cafeteria food and handfuls of mini Snickers bars, which were handed out in the resident workroom on some nights. I went months without writing or drawing or playing my guitar. And while I had a fiance who was very supportive, we seldom had quality time together. This sense of isolation from my family, from my friends, but most of all, from myself, was not unique to me. The problem of resident burnout is a national one, a systemic one, and one that is being increasingly recognized in the news and within the medical community. A 2015 study showed that the prevalence of depression among resident physicians is around 29%, compared to around 6 to 8% of the general population. And there are a lot of thoughtful people across the country, including at my own institution, who are considering and reconsidering how can we achieve resident wellness. And they've tried everything from building and implementing a resiliency curriculum to trotting out therapy dogs in the resident workroom. And while, as a resident, a good snuggle with a golden retriever could definitely bring a smile to my face, it could not sustain me. The problem was that I was exhausted, physically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. And then something in my body shifted. I got my period, like normal, but for whatever reason that month it really seemed to knock me down. I felt feverish for a few days, and then, out of the blue, my bladder suddenly went into spasm, causing a terrible sensation of having to pee all the time. This had never happened to me before. I had no idea what was causing it, but I had the feeling that it was the beginning of what would be a long journey, and it was. So I went to see a primary care doctor, and I don't know if it's because I'm a young woman who works in healthcare who already has a little bit of anxiety, but she was rather dismissive of my concerns and kind of made me feel like a hypochondriac. So I tried a couple of urologists. The first one told me that the pelvic floor is a black box that nobody understands, which as I learned later is true. And the other gave me a long list of bladder irritants to avoid in my diet, things like caffeine, alcohol, and spicy food. Nobody really seemed to know what was going on. Then the problem got worse. I started having excruciating menstrual cramps. Sometimes they would wake me up from the middle of the night. At their worst, it felt like someone was wringing out my pelvic organs, draining them of the blood supply, a pain so intense that I could barely hold a conversation when it was happening. At this point, as a doctor, I wondered if maybe my symptoms were from something called endometriosis, which is a common condition of young women my age, where abnormal tissue implants outside the uterus and causes inflammation and pain. So I went to see a gynecologist. I told her my story, and she didn't think it sounded like endometriosis, although she couldn't really offer an alternative explanation for what was going on with me. So I tried another gynecologist, and this one thought that endometriosis was possible, but she agreed that my story was atypical. And since the only way to definitively diagnose endometriosis is highly invasive, surgery, she instead wanted me to try physical therapy for 3 months. And I knew physical therapy was a powerful tool, but somehow this didn't feel right to me. Nonetheless, I wanted to be a good patient, and so I agreed to give it a try. Meanwhile, I kept working. In the hospital, I would run to the bathroom every half hour to pee. I felt anxious if I wasn't around a bathroom. Some of you may have had this feeling today, not being able to get out and go to the bathroom, if you know how that feels. And outside the hospital, activities that used to seem simple and fun, like going for a long walk or going to a concert, just felt out of reach. I was more comfortable at home in the bath or in bed with my heating pad. And at that point, even my personal identity seemed to be at stake. I mean, if I wasn't the girl who was ready to go for a hike in Marin on my day off or walk to a new restaurant that served spicy food, then now, who was I? I felt completely alien to myself. And I doubted myself. I mean, my gynecologic surgeon was one of the most talented physicians I had ever come across. She had a ton of experience, and I trusted her implicitly. So if she wasn't confident in the diagnosis of endometriosis, maybe I didn't have that at all. But then what did I have? I thought, wow, what if she surgically opened me up to look for endometriosis and there was nothing there? How embarrassing would that be? I wondered if my symptoms would continue forever, and if so, what that would mean for my life, for my career as a doctor. I wondered whether my fiance would still want to marry me. It was a pretty dark place. But then I thought back to my sleepless nights of training. I thought back to the agony that I had been in over the last several months, and I decided that I was not going to doubt myself anymore. So I went back to my gynecologist early, and she agreed to operate. And she put me on the schedule for her next available opening around a month and a half away. Finally, around 1 year after my symptoms started flaring up, the big day came. A close friend and my now husband brought me to the hospital early in the morning, the very hospital where I worked. And as we sat in the waiting room, I shielded my face, hoping that none of my colleagues would walk by and recognize me. For some reason, I just didn't want them to see me be sick. 4 hours of surgery later, I came out of anesthesia to find my friend and my husband sitting on the edge of my bed. And they said to me, "You were right. There was endometriosis everywhere." And they showed me photos of my disease all over my bladder, all over my left ovary. And while I wish I could tell you that I felt relief, validation, even vindication, I think really what I felt was more of a numbness. The recovery took longer than I expected. My skilled surgeon had cut out all of the inflammation, and as a result, much of my pain was gone, which was great. But my pelvic floor had been so dysfunctional for so long that I continued to struggle with muscle spasms, which I quickly realized my surgeon was not going to solve. She had done her job, and now my work was just beginning. I needed to heal from my physical wounds, but also from my psychological ones. Because despite good intentions, many of these doctors had made me doubt the physical experience that I was having in my body. I have 7 years of medical training under my belt. The human body is my territory. And so I thought, surely if I, as a patient, were made to doubt myself, many, many other people are too. I needed to learn how to trust myself again. A few months after my surgery, I finished my residency, I graduated, and for the first time in years, wellness became available to me. I slept, and I cooked, and I had the time and the space to explore the landscape of alternative therapies, massage, meditation, yoga, acupuncture, physical therapy. And to be honest, as a doctor, I didn't know a whole lot about this stuff. With my patients, I had always endorsed these things with a sort of vague positivity. If it helps you, great. But I had no idea how powerful they really could be. For example, my physical therapist put me in a chair, and she showed me how if I took long, slow, deep breaths and relaxed the muscles around my ears and around my jaw, I could bring the tone of my pelvic floor from a 15 down to a 10. A masseuse worked on me, pointing out different areas of anatomic tension that I had been oblivious to for years. And both of these practitioners listened to me describe what it's like to inhabit my body, with a quiet patience. And their prescriptions were basic. I had to sleep. I had to eat better. I had to relax my mind. I had to meditate. I had to move my body. I had to get my blood pumping. I had no idea how difficult it would be to incorporate these seemingly simple practices into my busy life. I didn't know how hard it would be to be patient, to trust that my healing would happen in time, to recognize that I could not bully my body into relaxation, that it had to happen naturally, that I had to let go. You know, even before I got sick, I had been troubled by the fact that people seem to have this exalted view of doctors, this view that we are somehow above human needs. And I wanted to start a project that would shine a light on the human side of physicians. So in my second year of residency, I started a live storytelling event for physicians called the Nocturnists. Our first event was in January 2016. I rented out a Victorian living room for $90, and I filled it with as many of my colleagues as I could find. It was a small crowd, only around 40 people, but as residents and even a couple faculty stood up one by one and shared their stories and bared their souls, there was this electricity in the room, this sense of mutual understanding that we were not alone. And as we continued to do events, I started getting emails from strangers across the Bay Area, doctors, people sending me their writing, even nurses, physical therapists, hospital administrators, asking me if they could share their stories on the Nocturnist stage. A year after that first event, we had another with an audience of 250 people. And today, the project continues to grow. Storytelling is at the heart of medicine. A doctor's job is to take a patient's history and pass it on, but not before stripping it of all the details and reducing it to a sterile clinical core. But the Nocturnist celebrates a different kind of storytelling, one where color and texture and humor and doubt and vulnerability are celebrated. And I think for doctors, this can be really therapeutic and cathartic. And for non-doctors, I think hearing doctor stories helps pull back the curtain on medicine a little bit and helps us realize that doctors are just people who laugh at work, people who struggle with moral distress, people who need sleep, people who need to be cared for. I'm a different doctor today than I was a few years ago. I still marvel at modern medicine, the increasing precision of cancer therapy, the growing arsenal of immunomodulators, the talented surgeons who perform life-changing operations, including mine. But I've gained a renewed appreciation for the humanistic aspects of care, for the importance of making my patients feel seen and heard and safe, for having a healthy dose of humility, for respecting the patient's intuition, for the power of the mind-body connection, for the virtues of holistic care. I have learned what it means to aim not just for health, but for wellness. Thank you.